It's Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for today. This is the Torah portion uncensored section of the podcast. But before I begin, if you like this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, like it, wherever you listen to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else. That helps other people also see it. Thank you so much. Now on to the Torah portion at hand, which is Kisetze. I want to focus on a few laws found in the Torah portion, which seem to be rather challenging and seem to be really jarring, especially to our modern mind. So this is chapter 22, verse 13, Perek Chav Beis, Pasuk Yud Gimel, and it talks about what happens if a man marries a woman and he doesn't like her, and then he says some things about her which are false and is proven to be incorrect. So let's read that. If a man takes a woman and cohabits with her, and then he hates her, he takes a dislike to her, and he makes up a charge against her and defames her, and he says, this woman I took, and I got close to her, and I found that she was not a virgin. So what happens in that case? In that case, the girl's father and mother should produce the evidence of the girl's virginity before the elders of the town at the gate. So he should find the sheet which they cohabited on, and to show that there's blood there, and therefore she was in fact a virgin. Then, verse 16, and the girl's father shall say to the elders, to this man I gave my daughter as a wife, but he has hated her. And he goes on to say that he made up things about her, and he said that I didn't find that she was a virgin, and they shall spread out the cloth or the sheets before the elders of the town, and the elders of the town shall then take that man, the husband in other words, and they should flog him, and this is the important part that I want to focus on, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, because there has been a defamation on a virgin of Israel, and then she shall remain his wife, and he shall never have the right to divorce her. He can never send her all his days. And then it goes on to say, and what happens if it's true, in fact she wasn't a virgin? Then the woman or the girl gets punished and she gets stoned to death. So again, a woman gets married, and it turns out that the husband hates her and he would like to divorce her. So he says she's not a virgin. And it's interesting that the reason why he says she wasn't a virgin is because that, as we will see soon, is grounds for divorce. He comes along and says she wasn't a virgin. The father proves that she was in fact a virgin, and the punishment is that he has to pay money to the father, and he cannot divorce the woman. He has to remain married to her for the rest of his life. So he's not allowed to divorce her at all. Now let's look at what it says about divorce, because that is an important part of this. Divorce is actually found also in this Torah portion. Chapter 24, Perek Chav Dalet, it says, Ki yikach ish isha uv'ala v'haya im lo yisim sochein be'einav ki motza v'ervas davar v'chas v'lasev v'krisus v'nosam b'yada v'shilcha mi beisai. And when a man takes a woman and cohabits with her, and she doesn't find favor in his eyes, why? Because he finds in her a ervas davar. An ervas davar here would mean something that was immoral, something that was corrupt within her. So in other words, he finds perhaps that she wasn't a virgin. So then he writes for her a sefer krisus. A sefer krisus, that is the biblical term for a bill of divorce. Krisus really means of separation. V'nosan biyad, and he gives into her hand, v'shilch mi beisai, and he sends her from his house. So that's what divorce is all. So it seems from these two sections that, number one, if a person gets married and he realizes that actually he doesn't like her and he wants to divorce her. The grounds for divorce is if he finds something immorally corrupt within her. So he makes it up, and if he makes it up, then he can never get divorced from her. But if it turns out that it can't be disproven, and he finds this ervas dava in her, he finds this morally corrupt thing within her, then he can divorce her, and he writes the Sefer Krisos, this bill of divorce, bill of separation between the husband and the wife, and he sends her from the house. So, in Jewish law, the idea of a divorce is something which is in the hands of the husband to do. The husband sends her away. A wife can't send herself away. If you read this in its plain, simple interpretation, Ein mikra yosim de pshuta, as it says, that no verse can be taken out of its simple explanation, it seems to be saying the following, that in a case where a man marries a woman and he hates her, and he makes up something about her of whole cloth, he says she wasn't a virgin, and it turns out she was a virgin, then they have to remain married. How do I know they have to remain married? Because the whole idea of a divorce is something where he sends her out, and here it says he can't send her out. A woman can't send herself out of a marriage. That doesn't exist. Once a woman gets married, the only possibility, the only way out of the marriage is if the man sends her out. The man writes this bill of divorce. And in that case, she can get sent out. And also the only way in which the man can divorce her is if he finds an ervas davar, this morally corrupt thing within her. There's no other grounds for divorce from the Bible, it seems, from the Torah, except for if he finds an ervas davar. If he doesn't find an ervas davar, there's no way, he can't even divorce her. So the only grounds for divorce is if he finds something morally corrupt. If there's nothing morally corrupt, there are no grounds for divorce, he can't divorce her. So in the case where he makes up a ervas davar, he makes up a grounds for divorce, in that case, he can never divorce her, he can never send her away. Now what it seems from this is that the woman never has a say in whether she can get divorced or not. What if the woman wants to get divorced? Well, it's not one of the options. Once a woman is married, the only way to get out is if the husband decides he wants to get out. How can that be? That seems to be, to our modern mind, very jarring. So if you look at actually the Talmud itself, the Talmud has a few comments on this, and it doesn't really get into the conversation about it. It just makes very clear that it sees these verses slightly differently. So if you look at the Gemara in Ksubas Daf Lamed Tes, so Ksubas 39, and also in Gittin Daf Tzadik, page 90 in Gittin, it's clear in the Talmud that when it says Lo yuchel l'shalchal kol yomov, that he can't send her out all his days, in other words, he can't divorce her if it turns out that the slander he said against her is not true, that means that he can't divorce her. In other words, he can't initiate the divorce. But what if she wants to initiate the divorce? If she asks or demands a divorce, in that case, he can divorce her. As a matter of fact, the Talmud actually says that if he ends up divorcing her and it's not something she wants, then he's obligated to take her back. In other words, this concept of being able to divorce her, lo yuchal l'shachal kiyomov, he can't send her away all his days, in other words, that he can't divorce her, is not that it's impossible for him to divorce her. Rather, it means that it's not desirable that he should divorce her. And if he does divorce her, then he has to remarry her. But it's not the concept that divorce can't occur. It's really interesting because there is this concept in the Talmud which says that a woman, when she gets married, is similar to when she goes out. In other words, there's a connection between the marriage and the divorce. In this case, there isn't really a connection. What one would think would be the connection. Well, there is this idea that there are certain kinds of relationships where marriage just doesn't take effect. Kedushin isn't teifus, that's the concept. Marriage just doesn't take effect. So, if a man wants to marry his sister, for example, and he goes ahead and he goes through the whole wedding ceremony, and he follows all the laws of the wedding, are they married or are they not married? The answer is they're not married, because there is no such thing as a marriage between a brother and a sister. So one might think that when the Torah says, Lo yuchel l'shalchal kol yomav, that he can't send her out all the days of his life, it might mean that there is no possibility for divorce here at all. In other words, just like in certain relationships, there's no possibility for a marriage, there's no such thing as kedushin in that relationship. One cannot marry one's parent. One cannot marry one's sibling. It also could be that one cannot divorce a woman who one was Moitzi Shemran, who one created this slander about. And that's why it says, Lo yuchol l'shalchol kol yom, you can't send her, because the idea of sending her away, the whole idea of Sefer Krisos, of writing this bill of divorce, just doesn't apply to this type of relationship anymore. So from an unbiased, simple reading of the text, it would seem that that's what the text is saying. In this scenario, divorce is just not on the table. It's not possible. He can't send her away. But that's not how the rabbis read it. The rabbis read it, yes, it's possible for him to send her away. He can send her away. It's just not desirable to send her away. And if he does send her away, he has to remarry her. If she initiates the desire to be sent away, no problem, he can send her away. Again, that is not the simple reading of the verse. But the rabbis seem to read that into it. This seems to me to be an example where the rabbis reread texts to make it much more palatable. Because think about it. It doesn't seem fair at all that a woman who is in a relationship where the husband hates her to the degree that he's willing to slander her is now forced to remain married to her and doesn't have an opportunity or an option for divorce at all. That doesn't seem fair. And there is a fundamental concept which is found amongst the rabbis that dorcheha darchei noyem v'chol nisivusei hashalom, the pasuk says. The verse says that its ways are pleasant ways and all its pathways are peace. So the idea that you should have something which seems to be fundamentally unfair to the woman is something which the rabbis are just not going to read it that way. They're going to read it in a way which is much fair to the woman. And they're going to, in a sense, read it in a way in which isn't necessarily in line with the literal interpretation in order to make it seem much more fair to the woman. And this would seem to be one of those cases where the rabbis, they didn't even go through backwards and forwards and say, well, maybe, why does it say this and why does it say that? As you would find in the Talmud, it goes backwards and forwards and argues. This case, there's not even an argument about it. It seems very clear. It's just obvious to the rabbis in the Talmud that, yes, he can send her away. Although it says directly in the verse, Loi yuchal l'shalchol kol yom, if he can't send her away all his life, it says that he can't send her away. The rabbis see it obvious as, yes, he can send her away. If he wants to send her away, he can send her away, but he would have to remarry her. So he can send her away. He just has to remarry her. But the Torah doesn't say if he sent her away, he has to remarry her. The Torah says he can't send her away. The rabbis understand that to mean he can't send her away, meaning that if he does send her away and he does write this bill of divorce, she's sent away, but he's obligated to remarry her. What if she initiates the desire to be sent away? Then he can send her away. Again, that's not the literal reading. The literal reading is he can't send her away. He has to keep her as a wife for forever, and that is his punishment. The fact that it seems to be also a punishment for the woman, the Torah doesn't seem to be bothered by that at all. The rabbis seem to be bothered by that, and therefore they read it differently. The other thing which is interesting is that the grounds for divorce is also something which is a conversation found in the Talmud. And there's actually a debate about what the grounds for divorce should be. In the Torah, it says, when we just read the verse, the first verse of chapter 24, Perik Chav Dalet, Pasuk Aleph, it says, Kikach ish isha uvala, we just read this, if a man took a woman and cohabited with her, v'hoyim lo tzimtzochem be'einav, and if she doesn't find favor in his eyes. Why? What does it mean she didn't find favor in his eyes? Because he found within her some kind of moral blemish. Then, because of Los Sefer Krisos, then he writes for her a bill of divorce. It seems, from a literal interpretation, that what are the grounds for the divorce? Only if he finds within her some moral blemish. And that's the reason why he doesn't like her. What if he doesn't like her for another reason? He just doesn't like the way she looks anymore. Or he doesn't like her because he doesn't like the way she talks to him. Would that be grounds for divorce? It seems from the literal reading of the verse that wouldn't be grounds for divorce. Grounds for divorce are based on some kind of moral imperfection that he finds within her. And that is a debate found in the Mishnah in Gittin. And there's an argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. One says that only if he finds an ervas dava, only if he finds a immoral blemish in her, can he get divorced. Another one says no, he can give her a divorce even in a situation where she cooks him something which he doesn't like. And there's a third opinion which says that even if he finds somebody else who looks nicer than his wife, he can still divorce her in order to get married to the other woman. In other words, there's three opinions. And there's a discussion about what this word ervas davar means. So what does it mean? If the Torah just says that it can only be if there's an ervas davar, if a thing of moral blemish happens, then he can divorce her. But what if there's not that? So the Talmud goes and says, well, there's two words. There's ervas and there's davar. So these two words, one can mean moral, another one can mean anything. Not just a moral imperfection, but anything which is an imperfection is like a moral imperfection, he can divorce her. So again, that isn't literal explanation, but the rabbis read into it that there can be lots of different grounds for divorce beyond just the fact that there's some kind of moral problem going on with the woman. The man has much greater latitude in order to be able to find grounds for divorce. So the rabbis reread texts in order to make them more palatable, if you like, to make them in a way that they have greater applicability to the world in which people live in. Now, a lot of people will say, one second, this isn't just the rabbis rereading it. This is actually part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. And the written law, which is the Torah itself, can't be understood except through the prism of the oral law. And that is the traditional Jewish explanation, the Orthodox Jewish interpretation of all of this. Now, in another episode, I discussed Lord Jacobowitz's opinion, in which he says that the rabbis used a lot of their interpretations as devices in order to bring a lot of the texts found in the Torah in line with a more palatable moral perspective. And one might argue that some of this is doing exactly that. Now, in the first case that I mentioned, which is the case of where the man creates slander, they don't even use a device. They just interpret the words as if from at first glance in a way in which says that lo yechol l'shalchel kol yamav, he can't send her away all the days of his life. That just doesn't mean he can't actually physically send her away. It just means that if he does, he has to take her back. But if she wants to be sent away, then he can send her away. So that interpretation is like ab initio, interpreting it that way. Seems like the rabbis do that because the literal way of reading it would be unpalatable, entirely unpalatable. It would be totally unfair to the woman. So therefore, the rabbis are never going to interpret it that way. This one here, where it talks about the grounds for divorce, the rabbis actually do use a literary device to broaden the grounds for divorce, beyond just if he finds some kind of moral iniquity within her. Rather, he finds other things he doesn't like about her, like she cooks the wrong food or burns the food, or he just finds somebody else that he likes better. So they do use a literary device and a novel type of literary reinterpretation of the words in order to be able to expand the grounds for divorce, not just for the man, but for the woman as well. In other words, the woman, she doesn't have to go and cheat on her husband in order to get divorced. If she wants to get divorced for other reasons, then she might be able to ask for it. The man can't come along and say, no, 1 second, you didn't cheat on me, therefore I'm not going to divorce you. So it's also in fairness to the woman, but it's also in fairness to the man. He might not like her for other reasons, not just because she cheated on him, or maybe she didn't cheat on him, but he still doesn't like her. There might be a reason for divorce. So it's unfair to only allow divorce in the case where the woman cheated on him. So the rabbis use an innovative literary device in order to be able to reread those texts. But what I'm saying here is that going along with what Lord Jacobowitz said in his article called A Modern Blood Libel, L'Affaire Shahak. So in that article in the Tradition Journal, says former Chief Rabbi of England, the late Lord Jacobowitz, but in moral reasoning, the second alternative would represent a bold and ingenious device of the rabbis to operate an ethical corrective in their legislation, even to the extent of overriding biblical laws conflicting with this biblical transgression. So this is the idea that I want to mention here, is that the rabbis use ingenious devices to operate ethical correctives in their legislation to the extent of overriding biblical laws. The idea of an ethical corrective. And I would argue this is an example of an ethical corrective. Two of them. Number one, the idea that the woman should be tied to the man forever, a man who hates her, and never being allowed to leave that marriage, that would seem unethical. And the rabbis override that with an ethical corrective and say, no, it doesn't mean he can't send her away ever. It just means if he sends her away and it's against her will, he has to remarry her. But if she wants to get out, then he can send her away. And the other thing is the idea that there can be multiple grounds for divorce. Not just the grounds for divorce related to the fact that she cheated on him, but there could be many other grounds for divorce as well. And the rabbis use a literary device to expand the grounds for divorce. Now, I want to go back quickly to what I started talking about, mentioning, which is a lot of people would say, what do you mean literary device? What is the former chief rabbi, Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, talking about here when he says that there was some kind of device the rabbis used? This is just Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is the oral law. And the oral law comes together with the written law. And it's just the way it's read. Because this is the true meaning of the pasuk. This is the true meaning of the verse. The true meaning of the verse is, Lo yochel shachal kol yom, if he can't send her all his days of his life. That doesn't literally mean he can't send her away, because the oral law says it means that if he sends her away, he has to remarry her. It doesn't mean literally he can't send her away. And when it says kimotzuba ervastava, it doesn't just mean ervas. If he can divorce her if he finds an ervastava, it doesn't just mean an ervastava. It doesn't just mean some kind of moral inequity. He finds other things in her as well. It's also able, and that's what the Torah actually means, and that's what it meant in the verse itself. So to jump into the next portion, which is Kisetze, I want to show another thing which is found in the text, which it seems like the commentators themselves are willing to question the way in which the oral law interprets some of the text itself. In other words, what I'm going to argue here is that in some way there's a precedent to show that although the oral law might see it one way, but that's not literal interpretation, and the oral law has its own reason, and the rabbis have their own reason to interpret it differently than what one might see as the literal reading of the verse. So if you look in Parshas Kisetze, Deuteronomy, Devarim, Perek Chavav, Pasuk Hey, chapter 26, verse 5, it says, and this is talking about Bikurim. So you're bringing the first fruits up to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, the priest takes the basket full of fruit from the hand of the person making the offering, and he places it in front of the altar, and then the person bringing the fruit says the following, Pasuk Hey, and you should answer and say in front of the Lord your God, Arami oivid ovi, vayered mitzrayma vayogasham bimsei meot, vayhisham legagadol otzum v'rav. Now, these words, Arami oivid ovi, it's translated in many different ways. So if one takes a look where else this is found, it's found in the Haggadah. The Haggadah which we say on the Seder in Pesach. And there, it is translated as, the Aramean destroyed my father, V'yerid Mitzrayim, and he went down to Egypt, V'yogasham bimsei me'ot, and he sojourned there with a small number of people, V'yisham le'gad lotzum v'rav, and he became a great and populous nation there. So that is the way it's translated in the Haggadah. And why is it translated that way in the Haggadah? Because in the Haggadah, it starts off by saying, come and learn what Laban, the Aramite, and Laban, by the way, was Jacob's father-in-law, for those who don't know. Jacob, the biblical figure Jacob, his father-in-law. Go and learn what Laban, the Aramite, did to Jacob, our father, because Pharaoh only decreed on the males, because he wanted to kill all the males and send them into the Nile to be drowned. But Laban, he wanted to uproot everything. And then it quotes this verse in Deuteronomy 26:5, which says, Arami ovid avi, that the Aramean destroyed our father. So that is the way it's read, and according to the interpretation of the sages, it seems, which is found in the Haggadah, that is the way it's read. it's talking about who? It's talking about Laban. And Laban tried to destroy our father. Who is our father? Our father is Jacob. But if you look at the commentators, the Rashbam, and if you look at other commentators like Ibn Ezra and others, they say it's actually not talking about Laban. The Rashbam, for example, says, Avi Avram, Arami Hoya, that our father Abraham was Aramite. He came from the land of Aram. He was actually exiled from the land of Aram. God told him, Lech lecha mi'artzecha, go away from your land and from your father's land and from your birthplace. And that's why he was lost, in a sense, because once you leave the place of your birth, you leave your father's house, you can be lost. And so Abraham was lost. And that was what it means, Arami Ovidavi, that the Aramite, the person from Aram, he was Ovidavi, he was lost, in a sense. Oved was lost. And then they went down to Egypt, and now, look, so we started off from a nomad of Abraham who was lost, and now we became this great and populous nation. That's what the verse is saying, according to Rashbam. According to Ibn Ezra, it's talking about Jacob. And the Ibn Ezra actually has a reason why it can't be talking about Laban. Because according to the Ibn Ezra, if it was talking about Laban, it wouldn't say Arami Oved Avi. It would say, if it was talking about that Arami, the Aramite, Laban, destroyed our father, it would say something different. It would say Arami Ma'abedav, or it would say Arami Ma'avid Avi, which would be more grammatically correct if you want to say that the Aramite destroyed our father. He was Ma'aved Avi. He destroyed our father. What does it mean, Oved Avi? So he says it must be talking about the Arami is talking about Jacob. And therefore it means that Arami, which is Jacob, the Aramite, when he was in the land of Aram, Oved Avi, our father was lost there. Because he was, again, similar to Abraham, he was outside of his comfort zone and he was lost there. He was working for Laban and he was a lost soul in a sense during his time when he was in Aram. Then Jacob went down to Egypt and he stayed there, few in number, and he became this great and populous nation. So it was Jacob who was the Arami. So this is the Ibn Ezra, the Rashbam, and others who seem to disagree on the interpretation of the text with the oral law which is found in the Haggadah. The Haggadah came before the Ibn Ezra, and certainly the Haggadah came before the Rashbam. And as a matter of fact, one finds that the Haggadah is from the 8th century. It showed up first time in a prayer book in the 8th century. But if you look in the Talmud itself, although it mentions the Haggadah, it says, we start reading from Arami Ovidavi, from these words, from this verse, but you don't find the bit in the actual Talmud about Arami Ovidavi, me being Laban. So that bit isn't actually found in the Talmud itself. This is just a side note. So one might say that maybe this interpretation of Arami Ovidavi, the Aramean being Laban, is actually something which is a little bit later. But how late could it be? The 800s. So that is certainly earlier than the Ibn Ezra, certainly earlier than the Rashbam. And still, it seems that the Rashbam and Ibn Ezra and others are willing to interpret the verses differently than the oral law interprets them, and says that really the literal meaning of these words are different than the way the words are interpreted by the oral law found in, for example, the Haggadah which you read on Pesach. What I'm trying to say with this is that even if you say that the way the Gemara interprets the words of the Bible, of the Chumash itself, this is what it really means, we find instances where the commentators are willing to interpret it differently. And there's also this concept of ein mikra yosin de pshutai, that you can't take the words of the mikra, of the text of the Bible itself, of the scripture, from its literal interpretation. And therefore, I would argue that although one could argue that the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the words of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that in some sense, according to tradition, that is what it really means. But still, there is the literal translation, and then there's the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So one could still argue Lord Jacobowitz's argument, the chief rabbi's argument, and say that the Torah Sheba'al Peh focuses on the idea of Darchei Noyam, that all its ways are pleasant, v'chol nesivoseh shalom, and all of its pathways are peace. And because it focuses on that, you find that the oral law, the rabbis, will use interpretations which lead to peace. And in this case, when we talk about the divorce, if the woman's never allowed to get out of a bad marriage, then that wouldn't lead to peace. And if the grounds for divorce are very limited and not broadened, that also wouldn't lead to peace. And therefore, they're going to find ways to interpret this verse in a way in which leads to peace. And that is the overriding way in which the rabbis will interpret the verses. And even if the literal interpretation seems differently, the laws end up being in a way in which lead to peace. And I was just showing an example from the Arami Ovid Avi to show that, in fact, sometimes the commentators are willing to actually argue and disagree with the way the oral law interprets a certain verse in a certain way and say, look, that doesn't look really in line with the actual literal interpretation of the scripture itself. This has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today, the Torah portion, uncensored portion of the podcast. This has been the portion of Kisetze. Thank you so much for joining. Happy to hear your comments, and until next time.